This story is titled, I Dedicated My Life to Our Family Business. But when my father retired, he handed everything to my unqualified sister instead. Hi, everyone. Before we dive in, a quick favor. If you enjoy content like this, please hit the subscribe button. It's free, supports the channel, and makes sure you never miss out on amazing videos. All right, let's get started. I'm 29 male, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been tied to our family business. My dad, Hank, started the furniture company back in the 80s when he was barely scraping by. He always said it was his ticket out of poverty. What started as a tiny workshop in a rented garage grew into a full-scale operation, with a showroom, loyal clients, and a reputation for crafting some of the best custom furniture in the state. We didn't make cheap stuff you'd find at a big box store. No, we built pieces that people bragged about owning. Conference tables for high-end offices, hand-carved dining sets for wealthy families, and custom desks for executives who didn't blink at spending 5 figures on a workspace. Dad always called it functional art. Growing up, it was understood that I'd take over one day. Not in a golden spoon in your mouth kind of way, but more like, you're the oldest son, so this is your duty. I didn't mind. I loved the work. When I was 10, Dad started taking me to the workshop on weekends. At first, I was just sweeping floors and stacking scrap wood, but I soaked up everything. I watched how he worked with his hands, how he treated every piece of wood like it had its own personality. By the time I was a teenager, I was sanding and staining chairs, learning about tools, and tagging along to client meetings. Jake, Dad would say, this business isn't just about making furniture. It's about making relationships. People don't just buy our work, they buy us. That stuck with me. Meanwhile, my younger sister, Chloe, couldn't have cared less. She's 4 years younger than me and always acted like she was too good for anything that didn't involve social media or shopping. While I was in the workshop, Chloe was usually off with her friends, spending Dad's money on designer clothes or whatever the latest trend was. Chloe always had this air of entitlement. Even as a kid, she never heard no. If she wanted something, she got it. I remember one Christmas when she threw a tantrum because her tablet wasn't the exact color she wanted. She cried until Dad went out the next day and bought her the one she'd asked for. Meanwhile, I was expected to be the responsible one, the kid who didn't complain and got straight to work. By the time I graduated high school, I was practically Dad's right-hand man. College wasn't even a discussion. I went straight into the business. Why wouldn't I? I'd been preparing for it my whole life. I worked every department, warehouse, sales, admin, even delivery, so I'd know the company inside and out. Chloe, on the other hand, spent her college years finding herself. She switched majors 3 times before finally settling on marketing. Not that she ever planned to actually use her degree. After graduation, she floated between random projects, calling them passion ventures, that she dropped as soon as they got hard. Still, she loved showing off the family business. She'd tell her friends, my family owns this amazing company, but she never lifted a finger to help. She'd come into the showroom occasionally to get content for her Instagram, posting selfies with our work like she had anything to do with making it. It was frustrating, but I let it go. I figured she wasn't a threat. She'd never shown any real interest in the business. By the time I turned 27, I was running the day-to-day operation. Dad had started stepping back a little, letting me take the reins. He still handled the big picture stuff, but I was the one keeping the gears turning. I worked long hours, sacrificed weekends, and skipped vacations because I believed in what we were building. Dad always said, when the time comes, Jake, this business will be yours. You're the one who understands it, who cares about it. Those words kept me going, even when the work got exhausting. Then, last spring, Dad announced he was officially retiring. He called a meeting at the office to share some exciting news. I walked in that day thinking it was going to be a big moment for me, the moment I'd been working toward my entire life. Instead, I walked into a nightmare. When I got to Dad's office, Chloe was sitting in his chair, leaning back with her feet up on the desk. She had this smug grin plastered on her face, like she'd just pulled off the biggest prank of the century. Dad was standing next to her, looking calm. Too calm. Jake, he said, I've made a decision. Chloe is going to take over as CEO. At first, I thought I misheard him. What? I asked, genuinely confused. Chloe's taking the lead, he repeated, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. I laughed, waiting for the punchline. Good one, Dad. What's the real announcement? But he wasn't joking. He looked me dead in the eye and said, I think it's time for the company to evolve, and Chloe has the vision to take it to the next level. I stared at him, stunned. Chloe? The same Chloe who didn't even know the difference between oak and pine? The same Chloe who once asked me if plywood was a type of tree? Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with fake confidence. Relax, Jake. You'll still have your role here, I'm just bringing some fresh ideas to the table. I could feel my blood boiling. Fresh ideas? I shot back. You've never even worked here, Chloe. You have no idea how this company runs. She shrugged, like it didn't matter. That's why I'll have you to guide me, she said, flashing a fake smile. I turned to Dad, desperate for him to see reason. Dad, I've spent my entire life building this company with you. Chloe hasn't done anything. How is this fair? But he just sighed, like he was already tired of the argument. Jake, you're great at what you do, but Chloe's got connections. She understands how to modernize the business. This is what's best for the future. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything I'd done, everything I'd given up, Dad was handing over the business to Chloe on a silver platter. I felt like a stranger in my own family. Chloe just sat there, smirking, like she'd already won. And maybe she had. That was the moment I realized everything I thought I knew about my place in the family, about my future, was a lie. I walked out of that office in a daze. I couldn't process it. Chloe was running the company? The same sister who once bailed on her part-time summer job because she didn't like the uniforms? I didn't know whether to scream, laugh, or just quit on the spot. But I didn't quit. Not yet. I told myself I'd stick around, at least for a little while. Maybe Dad would come to his senses. Maybe Chloe would realize she was in over her head and step down. I didn't want to abandon the company. I'd poured too much into it. The employees trusted me. The clients trusted me. And deep down, I didn't trust Chloe to keep it together. But man, she didn't make it easy. The first week of her leadership was like watching a bad sitcom. She showed up to work on Monday at noon in a flashy outfit, sipping some overpriced drink and acting like she owned the place. I was already in my office when she barged in, dropped her designer purse on my desk and said, "Okay, Jake, let's talk strategy." Strategy? I asked, looking up from the paperwork I'd been buried in all morning. Yeah, like, what's our vibe? I feel like we need to rebrand, you know? Make things fresher, more modern. I blinked. Chloe, we don't need a rebrand. The brand works. It's why clients come to us. They know we deliver quality. She waved me off like I was boring her. Yeah, quality's great, but people want more these days. Like, what's our social media game? Are we doing collabs? Influencers? We need to go viral. I stared at her, dumbfounded. Chloe, this isn't a clothing brand. We make custom furniture. No one's buying a $10,000 conference table because they saw it on TikTok. Her eyes lit up like I'd just given her the best idea ever. Oh my God, Jake, yes! TikTok. That's what we need to do. Viral videos of us making furniture. I didn't even know how to respond. She was treating this company like it was some kind of hobby project, not a decades-old business with real clients and real responsibilities. Things only got worse from there. Chloe started making changes without consulting anyone. She canceled long-standing contracts with suppliers because she didn't like their vibes and tried to switch to cheaper materials to cut costs. I told her it was a bad idea, that our clients would notice the difference in quality, but she didn't listen. It's about margins, Jake, she said, like she'd suddenly become a business guru. She also started throwing money around like it was Monopoly cash. She hired some trendy marketing firm to revamp our image, paying them an absurd amount for a new logo and some sleek but pointless website updates. Meanwhile, our existing clients were getting frustrated because their orders were delayed, and Chloe was too busy brainstorming brand aesthetics to care. The employees were starting to lose patience, too. Most of them had been with us for years, and they were used to a certain way of doing things. Chloe, of course, didn't bother to learn how anything worked before she started making changes. She'd show up late to meetings, throw out half-baked ideas, and then disappear for the rest of the day. One time, she scheduled an all-hands brainstorming session on a Friday afternoon. Everyone had to stop what they were doing and gather in the conference room, where Chloe spent an hour rambling about future-forward synergy and disrupting the industry. Nobody knew what the hell she was talking about. After the meeting, one of the senior craftsmen, Dan, pulled me aside. Dan's been with the company since the beginning. He's practically family. He shook his head and said, "Jake, I don't know how much more of this I can take. She's turning this place into a circus." I didn't blame him. I felt the same way. The final straw came about 2 months into Chloe's reign. We had a massive order for a luxury hotel chain, custom dining tables, chairs, and a centerpiece bar for one of their flagship locations. It was one of the biggest contracts we'd ever landed, and it was supposed to be my project. But Chloe, being Chloe, decided she wanted to take the lead. She completely ignored the timeline I'd put together and started making changes to the designs without consulting the client. When I confronted her about it, she rolled her eyes and said, "Jake, stop micromanaging. I know what I'm doing." But of course, she really didn't. The project fell apart. The client was furious, and we ended up losing not just the contract, but the relationship entirely. It cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars, not to mention the hit to our reputation. When I tried to talk to Chloe about it, she acted like it wasn't a big deal. It's just one client, she said. We'll bounce back. I couldn't believe how casual she was about it. This wasn't just one client. This was a huge deal for the company, and she'd completely screwed it up. That night, I sat in my office long after everyone else had gone home. I stared at the stack of papers on my desk, the invoices, the client emails, the production schedules, and felt this overwhelming sense of defeat. This wasn't the business I grew up loving. It wasn't the legacy Dad had built. It was a mess. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't clean it up. The next morning, I went to Dad's house. He was sitting on the porch, reading the paper like he always did. I sat down across from him and said, "Dad, we need to talk." He looked up, and I could tell he already knew what I was going to say. "I can't do this anymore," I told him. "Chloe's ruining the company. She doesn't know what she's doing, and she won't listen to me. You have to step in." Dad sighed and set the paper down. "Jake, I know it's been rough, but you've got to give her time. She's still learning." "Learning?" I snapped. "Dad, she's destroying everything you built. She's driving away clients. She's alienating the employees, and she's making terrible decisions. This isn't just rough. It's a disaster." He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he said, "Jake, I made my decision. Chloe's the CEO now. You need to support her." I stared at him, stunned. He was really going to let this happen. He was going to let her run the company into the ground. "Fine," I said, standing up. "But I'm done. If you want Chloe to run the company, she can do it without me." After walking away from the company, I felt empty. You'd think I'd feel relieved after all the crap I'd put up with, but honestly, it was the opposite. The business wasn't just a job to me, it was my whole life. I'd spent over a decade building it, making sure Dad's dream didn't just survive but thrived. Now, all of it felt like it was for nothing. The first couple of weeks were weird. I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd spent years waking up at 5 a.m., heading to the office, and not leaving until it was dark. Suddenly, I had all this time, and I hated it. I'd sit in my apartment, scrolling through job postings that didn't feel right. I couldn't imagine working for someone else, but starting over? That felt impossible too. Meanwhile, I heard bits and pieces about what was happening at the company. Old coworkers would text me, venting about how chaotic things had gotten. Chloe was doubling down on her modernization plans, ignoring deadlines, and alienating clients. One guy told me she'd fired 2 senior craftsmen because their vibe didn't fit the brand. Those men had been with the company for years, and now they were out of work because Chloe didn't like how they dressed. Clients were pulling out left and right. Orders were delayed. Quality was slipping, and the showroom was practically a ghost town. The worst part? Chloe didn't seem to care. She was too busy hosting vision meetings and posting selfies from the office, talking about how she was transforming the industry. One day, a former client reached out to me directly. It was the owner of a boutique hotel we'd worked with for years. He asked if I could take on a private project, something outside the company. He'd ordered custom furniture from us before, but with the current chaos, he didn't trust Chloe to handle it. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to step on any toes, and legally, I wasn't sure what I could do. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't owe Chloe or the company anything. I wasn't under contract, and I wasn't stealing clients. They were coming to me because Chloe had driven them away. So, I agreed. It wasn't a huge project, just a few custom tables and chairs for one of his new locations, but it felt good to be back in the workshop. I rented space in a friend's garage, bought some supplies, and got to work. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. When I delivered the finished pieces, the client was thrilled. He told me they were even better than what he'd gotten from the company before. That meant everything to me. It reminded me that I didn't need the family business to prove my worth. While I was finding my footing, things at the company were going from bad to worse. Chloe's big ideas were backfiring left and right. She'd sunk a ridiculous amount of money into a rebranding campaign that made no sense. The new logo looked like it belonged on a juice bar, not a high-end furniture company. Employees were leaving in droves. By this point, most of the senior staff had either quit or been fired. Chloe replaced them with her friends, people who had zero experience, but knew how to agree with her every whim. The craftsmanship suffered, the quality control went out the window, and the company's reputation took a massive hit. Even Dad couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, I got a call from Mom. She sounded exhausted, like she'd been crying. "Jake, your dad's not doing well," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "He's been feeling off for weeks. He finally went to the doctor, and they found something. He has lymphoma." Hearing those words felt like a punch to the chest. Dad was the strongest person I knew, the guy who'd built an empire with his bare hands. I couldn't imagine him being sick, let alone with cancer. It's early, she added quickly. The doctors are optimistic, but he needs to start chemo right away. I told her I'd be there the next day. When I saw Dad, he looked smaller. He was sitting in his recliner, a blanket draped over his legs, flipping through the TV channels like everything was fine. But I could see it in his face. He was scared. "Hey, kid," he said when I walked in. "Hey, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I wanted to ask a million questions. What stage was it? What were the odds? How long would treatment take? But I didn't. Instead, I just sat with him, and for the first time in a long time, we talked about normal stuff. Mom was the one who brought up the company. "Jake, it's a disaster," she said, her voice shaky. "Clients are leaving. The employees are miserable. And Chloe, she doesn't even come to the office half the time." I clenched my jaw. Of course, Chloe was nowhere to be found. Dad sighed. "She's trying," he muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. "She's not trying, Hank," Mom shot back. "She's failing, and you know it." I didn't say anything. What was the point? I'd been warning him about this for months, and he hadn't listened. Over the next few weeks, I split my time between helping Dad and working on small projects for clients who'd reached out to me. It was exhausting, but in a way, it felt good to stay busy. Chloe, on the other hand, completely disappeared. She didn't show up to the hospital, didn't call to check on Dad, didn't even send a text. When Mom tried to reach her, Chloe said she was too overwhelmed and needed space. Space? From what? She wasn't the one fighting cancer, and she sure as hell wasn't running the company. By the time Dad started his second round of chemo, the company was hanging by a thread. Employees were quitting faster than they could be replaced, and clients were openly trashing us online. I heard rumors that suppliers were refusing to work with us because Chloe hadn't paid them on time. Then, out of nowhere, Chloe packed up and moved to California. She left a vague email for the staff, something about seeking new opportunities, and that was it. She was gone. Mom called me the day Chloe's email went out. She was furious. "Jake, she abandoned us," she said. "She abandoned your father when he needs her most." I don't even know what to do anymore. I didn't know what to say. Chloe had always been selfish, but this was a new low. She'd walked away from the mess she'd made without a second thought, leaving the rest of us to pick up the pieces. By now, the company was in free fall. Clients were threatening lawsuits, employees were demanding unpaid wages, and Dad was too sick to step in. I knew I had to make a decision. Either let the company crumble or step in and try to save it. Part of me wanted to let it burn. After everything that had happened, after how Dad had dismissed me and Chloe had disrespected me, why should I care? But another part of me couldn't do it. This company wasn't just Dad's legacy, it was mine too. So I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. When I decided to step back into the company, I knew it wasn't going to be pretty. What Chloe left behind wasn't just a mess. It was a full-on dumpster fire. The employees were demoralized, the clients were pissed, and the company was hemorrhaging money. I wasn't even sure if it could be saved, but I couldn't just stand by and let Dad's life's work go up in flames. Walking back into the office felt strange. It had been months since I'd quit, and everything looked wrong. Chloe's ridiculous rebranding campaign was everywhere. Gaudy posters with meaningless slogans like "Elevate Your Space" plastered across the walls. The showroom was practically empty, and the few employees who were left looked like they were just going through the motions. I walked into the workshop, and my heart sank. The space, which used to be a hub of activity, was dead quiet. Only two craftsmen were left, Dan and another guy named Miguel. They were working on a half-finished dining table, their expressions grim. "Jake," Dan said when he saw me, "what are you doing here?" "I'm back," I said, trying to sound confident even though I wasn't sure what that meant yet. Dan raised an eyebrow. "You here to clean up Chloe's mess?" "Something like that," I muttered. He nodded, his face unreadable, then went back to work. The first thing I did was dig through the company's finances. It was worse than I thought. Chloe had blown through almost all of our reserves on her ridiculous modernization projects, flashy ad campaigns, unnecessary office renovations, and that overpriced marketing firm. Meanwhile, invoices from suppliers were piling up, and we had a stack of client refunds that hadn't been processed yet. The second thing I did was meet with the remaining employees. There weren't many left. Most of the senior staff had either quit or been fired, and the ones who stayed looked like they were ready to jump ship at any moment. I called a meeting in the conference room, and it was painfully awkward. The room was too big for the small group, and the tension was thick. "All right," I said, standing at the front of the room. "I know things have been rough lately. Chloe's decisions, well, let's just say they weren't great, but I'm here now, and we're going to fix this." One of the sales reps, Karen, raised her hand. "How? Half our clients have left, and the ones who haven't are threatening to sue us. Do you have a plan?" I didn't blame her for being skeptical. I'm working on it, I said honestly. But the first step is stabilizing what we have left. We're going to focus on fulfilling the orders that are still in the pipeline, and we're going back to basics: quality, reliability, and transparency. No more gimmicks, no more rebranding nonsense. They didn't look convinced, but I couldn't blame them. Actions speak louder than words, and I had a lot of work to do. The next few weeks were brutal. I worked nonstop, trying to put out fires while rebuilding relationships with clients and suppliers. I spent hours on the phone, apologizing to people who'd been burned by Chloe's incompetence and begging them to give us another chance. Some agreed, reluctantly, but others told me to get lost. One client, a small design firm we'd worked with for years, said, "Jake, I trust you, but I don't trust the company anymore. How do I know this won't happen again?" I didn't have a good answer. All I could do was promise to personally oversee their projects and hope they'd take me at my word. At the same time, I had to deal with the employees. Morale was at an all-time low, and I couldn't blame them. Chloe had treated them like pawns in her ridiculous schemes, and they were understandably bitter. I made it a point to talk to each of them individually, to hear their concerns and let them know I was there to support them. It wasn't easy. Some were hesitant to trust me after everything that had happened, and a few even told me they were planning to leave as soon as they found other jobs. But others, like Dan and Miguel, were willing to stick it out. For now, at least. Then there was Dad. He was still recovering from chemo, so he wasn't around much, but I kept him updated on what was going on. Every time I told him about another disaster I had to clean up, he'd sigh and mutter, "I should have listened to you, Jake." Part of me wanted to throw it in his face. Yeah, you should have. But what good would that do? He was already beating himself up enough. Instead, I focused on moving forward. One evening, I stopped by their house after work to drop off some groceries for Mom. She'd been too busy taking care of Dad to keep up with errands, so I figured it was the least I could do. When I walked in, Dad was sitting in his recliner, staring at the muted TV. He looked up when he saw me and gave a weak smile. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice a little raspy. "Hey, Dad," I replied, setting the bags on the counter. "You staying for dinner?" he asked. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to avoid sitting through another awkward meal where we danced around the elephant in the room. But then I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized I didn't know how many more dinners we'd have. "Yeah, I'll stay," I said, grabbing a chair and pulling it up next to him. We sat in silence for a while, watching some nature documentary about lions. I could tell he wanted to say something, but he kept clenching and unclenching his hands like he was trying to work up the courage. Finally, he spoke. "Jake, can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said, not sure where this was going. "Do you hate me?" The question hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't expecting that. I sat back, letting the words hang in the air for a moment before answering. "No, I don't hate you," I said honestly. "But I won't lie. It hurt, Dad. When you gave the company to Chloe, it felt like you didn't see me. Like all the work I'd done didn't matter." He nodded slowly, his eyes glued to the TV. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said after a long pause. "I thought Chloe needed it more than you did. You were always so steady, so dependable. I guess I figured you'd be fine no matter what." That stung in a different way. "Dad, I was fine because I worked my ass off to be fine. That doesn't mean I didn't need your support. You built that company, and I gave everything to keep it going. Then you handed it over to someone who didn't care." He winced, like the words physically hurt him. "I know," he said softly. "I know I messed up. I let you down. I thought Chloe would rise to the occasion. I didn't want to believe she'd walk away like that." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "She's been walking away her whole life, Dad. You just didn't want to see it." He didn't argue. Instead, he reached over and patted my arm with a trembling hand. "You've done more than I ever could have asked for, Jake. I'm sorry it took me so long to tell you that." Over the next few weeks, Dad started to open up more. I think seeing the company almost collapse, and Chloe's complete lack of accountability, was a wake-up call for him. He'd always been so focused on what he thought people could be that he ignored who they actually were. One night, while we were sitting in the living room, he told me about his early days in the business. "You know, when I first started, I had no idea what I was doing," he said with a chuckle. "Your mom and I used to argue all the time about money. She wanted me to get a regular job, something steady, but I was too stubborn to give up." "Sounds familiar," I joked, and he laughed harder than I'd heard in months. "It wasn't until I had you that I started to figure it out," he continued, his tone turning more serious. "I wanted to build something you could be proud of, something that would give you a better life than I had. And somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it felt genuine, and that was enough for me, for now anyway. My relationship with Dad still felt like it was hanging by a thread. There were nights I'd lie awake, replaying the moment he chose Chloe over me, wondering how he could have been so blind. As the weeks turned into months, things slowly started to stabilize. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of setbacks along the way, but we were making progress. I brought back some of the senior staff who'd left, convincing them that the company was worth saving. I reached out to old clients, offering discounts and guarantees to win back their trust. I even took on a few small projects myself, spending nights in the workshop to remind people what our company was really about. Chloe, of course, was still nowhere to be found. She was radio silent. She hadn't called, texted, or emailed since she left for California. As far as I was concerned, that was a blessing. The last thing I needed was her swooping back in to cause more chaos. Mom mentioned she'd tried to call her a few times, but Chloe never picked up. I wasn't surprised. She'd always been good at disappearing when things got tough. Then, one afternoon, Mom told me Chloe had sent an email. It wasn't an apology. Of course not. Instead, it was a rambling message about how she was exploring new opportunities and needed money to reinvest in herself. She said she's struggling to make ends meet. I couldn't stop myself from laughing when Mom told me. She wants money? I said, shaking my head. After everything she's done? Mom sighed. I told her no, we've got enough problems to deal with here, she said. I'm done enabling her. That was the first time I'd ever heard Mom put her foot down with Chloe, and honestly, it was a little shocking. I didn't say it out loud, but I was proud of her for finally standing up for herself. By the end of the year, the company was finally back on solid ground. We weren't thriving yet, but we were stable. I couldn't have done it without the employees who stuck by me, the clients who gave us another chance, and honestly, the lessons I'd learned from watching everything fall apart. Dad was still recovering, but he seemed stronger every day. And me? I was finally starting to feel like I was in control. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like things were heading in the right direction. I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay. I'd spent so much of my life tied to the company that I couldn't tell where it ended, and I began. And after everything, Dad's betrayal, Chloe's mess, and the months of picking up the pieces, I realized I needed something that was just mine. One evening, after dinner at my parents' house, I told Dad my decision. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, a couple of mugs of coffee in hand. Dad, I said, breaking the comfortable silence, I've been thinking, I'm not going to stay at the company. He looked at me, his face unreadable. For a second, I thought he might argue, try to convince me to stay. Instead, he just nodded slowly. I figured, he said quietly. I'm not leaving because of you, I added quickly, or because of Chloe. It's just, I need something new. I need to build something on my own. He took a sip of his coffee, then set the mug down on the table beside him. Jake, I get it. I really do. You've done more for this company than I ever could have asked, and if anyone's earned the right to move on, it's you. Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. Thanks, Dad, I said, my voice a little shaky. You know, he continued, leaning back in his chair, when I was your age, I didn't have half the guts you do. Starting this company was the scariest thing I ever did, but it was also the best thing I ever did. If you've got something you want to build, Jake, go for it. Don't wait around like I did. I nodded, letting his words sink in. For the first time in what felt like forever, we were on the same page. The next day, I handed over my resignation. Again. This time, though, I wasn't leaving in anger or frustration. I'd done my part, and I was ready to move on. I worked with the new leadership team to make the transition as smooth as possible, ensuring the company would keep running without me. It felt strange, stepping away after everything I'd been through, but it also felt right. I decided to start my own small woodworking business. Not a big operation like the family company, but something personal, something that reflected my own vision. I rented a little workshop on the edge of town and started taking on custom projects. At first, it was just me and a few basic tools. I'd spend my days crafting tables, chairs, and other pieces for local clients, and at night, I'd work on building a website and spreading the word. It was slow going, but it felt good. Honest, almost. Every piece I made was a reminder that I didn't need the family business to define me. Word started to spread, and before I knew it, I was getting more orders than I could handle on my own. I hired a couple of local craftsmen, guys I trusted to uphold the same standards I'd learned from Dad. And slowly, my little business started to grow. Meanwhile, things with my family were better. Not perfect, but better. Dad was getting stronger every day, and while he still couldn't do the hands-on work he used to love, he found other ways to stay involved. He'd stop by my workshop every now and then, offering advice or just sitting in the corner watching me work. Mom seemed more relaxed too. Without Chloe constantly causing drama, she had more time to focus on herself. She even picked up a new hobby, gardening, which she said helped her stay sane. As for Chloe, she was still in California, doing whatever it was she did. She hadn't reached out since her half-hearted email asking for money, and honestly, I was fine with that. Mom mentioned once that she'd heard through the grapevine Chloe was trying to start a boutique clothing line, but I didn't bother asking for details. One day, about 6 months after I left the family company, I got a call from an old client. It was the owner of a high-end restaurant who'd been with us back when I was still working under Dad. He'd heard about my new business and wanted to order a custom bar and dining set for his latest project. Jake, he said, I'll be honest. I was hesitant to work with the family company after everything that happened, but I've always trusted you. If you're the one making it, I know it'll be perfect. Hearing that made all the late nights and early mornings worth it. A few weeks later, I delivered the finished pieces to the restaurant. As I stood there, looking at the sleek, handcrafted bar I'd built from scratch, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just another project. It was a symbol of everything I'd overcome. As I was leaving, the owner shook my hand and said, "You've got a gift, Jake? Don't let anyone take that away from you." Looking back, I can't believe how much has changed. A year ago, I felt like I was drowning, trapped in a situation where I'd lost control of everything I'd worked for. Now, I'm standing on my own 2 feet, building something that's mine. The family business is still around, and from what I hear, it's doing okay under the new management team. I don't keep tabs on it, though. I've moved on, and for the first time in a long time, I feel free. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that sometimes you have to let go of what you thought your life was supposed to be. I spent years chasing Dad's approval, trying to live up to this idea of legacy he'd built in his head. But in the end, the only approval that really matters is your own. I'm not angry anymore at Dad, at Chloe, at any of it. It's all in the past. And while I can't say I'm thankful for the way things went down, I am thankful for where I've ended up. This new chapter isn't what I expected, but it's mine. And that's enough. Thanks for sticking with me through this story. If you've ever had to start over, or if you're thinking about it now, just know this. It's hard, but it's worth it. You're worth it.
I've always loved San Francisco. There's something about this city that feels like it's constantly alive, bustling with possibilities and hidden stories. I'm Maya, a 30-year-old graphic designer, and my life here has been a blend of work, quiet moments, and unexpected turns. I live alone in a chic, modern apartment that I'm proud to call my own. It's not huge, but it's perfect for me. The best part is its location. Just a short walk from the design firm where I spend most of my days. My job is my passion. I dive into my work with an intensity that often surprises me. Each project feels like a new adventure, a chance to create something unique and meaningful. On weekends, when I need to escape the buzz of the city, I head to a small park nearby. It's my sanctuary. The park isn't anything extraordinary, just a patch of green amid the concrete, but it's where I find peace. The tall trees and chirping birds offer a kind of quiet that's hard to find elsewhere in the city. It's here that I find solace and inspiration, a place where I can think and recharge. One crisp autumn afternoon, while I was enjoying the usual tranquility of the park, everything changed. I was lost in thought, sketching ideas for a new project, when a sudden commotion jolted me out of my reverie. I looked up to see a man sprawled on the grass, looking a bit disoriented. "Are you all right?" I asked, rushing over to him. The man, who looked to be in his mid-30s, blinked up at me. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tripped over my own feet," he said with a sheepish grin. His name was Jake, and as it turned out, he worked in real estate. Jake had a charisma about him that was hard to ignore. His outgoing personality contrasted sharply with my more reserved nature. Over the next few weeks, we kept running into each other in the park. What started as casual conversations soon blossomed into something more. We went from chatting about the weather to sharing stories over coffee. Our weekends began to revolve around each other, and before long, our time together extended into late-night dinners and even full weekends spent exploring the city. Our relationship progressed quickly. It felt natural and exciting, but also a bit overwhelming. One day, Jake proposed that we move in together. I was caught off guard. The idea of merging my life with someone else's was daunting, but I couldn't deny how much I cared for him. After some thought, I agreed. We found a larger apartment in a new part of the city, one with bright rooms and an airy feel that symbolized a fresh start for us. Moving in together was supposed to be a new beginning, but soon I noticed cracks in our seemingly perfect life. It started subtly. Jake suggested that I should cut back on my work hours to focus more on our home and our relationship. At first, I thought he was joking, but as he continued to press the issue, I realized he was serious. I was taken aback. My work meant everything to me. It wasn't just a job, it was a big part of who I was. The thought of stepping back from my career felt like losing a piece of myself. I tried to balance both, but the tension was palpable. The situation was further complicated by Jake's mother, Mrs. Harrison, who lived nearby. She visited often, and her presence added another layer of stress to our relationship. Mrs. Harrison, a woman in her early 60s, was kind but had strong traditional views about gender roles. Her comments about homemaking and prioritizing family over work made me feel as though my career was being dismissed as insignificant. Jake seemed to align with his mother's views more and more, and the strain began to show. Despite the growing pressure, I tried to stay optimistic. I found myself constantly juggling between fulfilling my work responsibilities and trying to meet the expectations set by Jake and his mother. It was like walking a tightrope, and I felt like I was about to fall off. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I sat in our new apartment feeling overwhelmed. I realized that I was losing sight of myself. My independence, which had always been my strength, was slipping away. It was in this moment of clarity that I decided I needed to do something to preserve my sense of self while navigating this new, challenging phase of my life. And so began a silent act of rebellion. I made a decision to pretend that I had quit my job while continuing to work from home. I set up a separate savings account to stash away money for my freelance projects. It was a way to reclaim a part of my life, a small, private rebellion against the pressure I was feeling. Little did I know, this decision would set the stage for a confrontation that would change everything. I thought moving in with Jake would be a new adventure, a chance to build something meaningful together. But as the weeks turned into months, the excitement of our new apartment began to wear off, revealing underlying issues we hadn't fully addressed. Jake's suggestions about my career continued. He would casually bring up the idea of me reducing my work hours, always framing it as a way to enhance our relationship. "It would be nice if you could be around more," he'd say, his voice filled with genuine concern. "We could use more time together. Maybe even work on making our place feel more like home." At first, I tried to brush it off. I thought maybe it was just a phase. But the more he brought it up, the more I felt like my independence was being chipped away. Balancing my job with the demands of our relationship was becoming increasingly difficult. I loved Jake, but I loved my work too. It was a core part of who I was. Things took a turn for the worse when Jake's mother, Mrs. Harrison, started visiting more frequently. Her visits were always polite, but they carried an underlying tension. Mrs. Harrison had her own ideas about how a woman should prioritize her life, and it seemed her opinions were influencing Jake more than I realized. One day, as I was preparing dinner, Mrs. Harrison stopped by unexpectedly. She looked around the kitchen and made a comment that stung. "It's important to make a home feel warm and inviting. You know, keeping things organized and spending time on it can really make a difference," she said, her tone casual but her words heavy with implication. I smiled tightly, trying to keep my composure. "I agree, Mrs. Harrison. I've been working on making it a comfortable place for us." "Oh, I'm sure you're doing your best," she replied, but there was a note of disapproval in her voice. "Sometimes, though, it's better to focus more on creating a nurturing environment at home rather than being too engrossed in work." The conversation left me feeling frustrated and trapped. Jake and I had never discussed this level of interference from his mother, and it seemed like he was aligning with her traditional views more and more. I began to feel like an outsider in my own home. I tried to adapt. I cut back on some work hours and focused more on the house, but it felt like a part of me was shrinking. Despite my efforts, the strain between us grew. Jake would often bring up how my work was keeping me away from our relationship. "You're always busy, Maya. Can't you take a break?" he'd say. The final straw came one evening when we had a particularly heated argument. Jake was frustrated, and his irritation bubbled over. "You don't support me or our future," he yelled. "You're always prioritizing your job over us. This isn't what I envisioned for us." I was devastated. I felt like I was being pulled in two different directions, torn between my love for Jake and my passion for my career. It seemed like nothing I did was ever enough. The pressure was relentless, and I was running out of ways to keep everything balanced. In a desperate bid to retain some control over my life, I decided to take a drastic step. I began to pretend that I had quit my job. Behind closed doors, I continued to work on freelance projects, setting up a separate savings account to stash away the money I earned. It was a secret rebellion, a way to keep a piece of my independence while trying to meet the expectations placed on me. Even though this plan provided me with a small sense of control, it added another layer of stress. Keeping up the pretense was exhausting. I had to be careful about when and how I worked, always making sure not to slip up. The emotional toll was immense, and it was becoming harder to maintain the facade. Jake's growing frustration was becoming more apparent. The tension between us reached a breaking point during one of his drunken outbursts. He accused me of undermining his vision for our future, insisting that I conform to his and his mother's expectations. It was a painful confrontation that left me questioning whether this relationship was worth the cost to my own well-being. I started to realize that no matter how much I tried to please everyone, I was losing myself in the process. The facade of harmony was cracking, and beneath it lay the painful truth that something had to change. I had to make a choice, one that would require me to confront the reality of my situation and decide what I truly wanted for my future. The atmosphere at home was growing more oppressive. Every day, it felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying to keep up the pretense of quitting my job while secretly working from home. The strain was taking its toll on me, and Jake's frustrations were becoming more frequent and intense. One evening, Jake came home late, his mood sour and his words sharp. He had been drinking, and it was clear that he was more than just tipsy. I could see the frustration in his eyes as he staggered into the living room. "Why are you still working?" he demanded, his voice slurring slightly. "I thought you were going to focus on our life together." I tried to stay calm. "I'm not working. I've told you, I'm focusing on us. I'm just tidying up some things." "Don't lie to me, Maya." His voice rose, and I could see the anger boiling over. "You're always working, always busy. What's the point of this if you can't even commit to us?" I was taken aback by his accusation. "I'm doing everything I can.
But this isn't just about me.
It's about us. I'm trying to balance both, but it's not easy." Jake's face flushed with rage. "Balance? It feels like you're always putting your work first. You're not supporting me or our relationship. You've changed, Maya." The words hit me hard. They were a reminder of everything that was wrong, of the constant pressure I felt to give up a part of myself for the sake of our relationship. But it wasn't just Jake's anger, it was his growing alignment with his mother's views that was causing the real conflict. His mother, Mrs. Harrison, had been visiting more often, her comments becoming sharper and more pointed. One day, while Jake was at work, she came by to discuss the progress of our new life together. She looked around the apartment with a critical eye, her disapproval evident. "You know," she said, "a woman's role is important in a home. It's about creating a warm and welcoming space. I hope you're not letting your work interfere with that." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I'm doing my best to balance everything, Mrs. Harrison." She nodded, but there was a hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "Well, it's important to make sure that your priorities are in the right place. A home needs a woman's touch." The pressure from Jake and his mother was relentless. It felt like I was being squeezed from all sides, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't meet their expectations without losing myself in the process. I was caught in a cycle of pretending and compromising, and it was beginning to break me down. The final confrontation came one night after a particularly intense argument. Jake was drunk again, his emotions raw and unfiltered. We were in the middle of a heated exchange when he suddenly shouted, "If you can't support me and our future, then what are we even doing here? I can't keep living like this." His words were like a knife to my heart. I felt a deep, crushing sense of realization. I couldn't keep living under this pressure. The constant struggle to maintain a facade, the relentless push to conform to someone else's expectations, it was all too much. In the heat of the moment, I made a decision that would change everything. "Maybe you're right," I said, my voice trembling. Maybe this isn't working. I can't keep living like this. Jake's face showed a mixture of anger and disbelief. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I nodded, feeling tears well up. I can't do this anymore. I need to find a way to be true to myself. I'm sorry, but I need to leave. The look on Jake's face was a mix of shock and fury. You're just going to walk away? I'm not walking away from you, I said, my voice firm despite the tears. I'm walking away from a life that's making me lose myself. That night, I packed a few bags with the essentials and made arrangements to stay with a friend. The decision wasn't easy, and it felt like I was tearing a piece of my heart away. But deep down, I knew it was the only way I could reclaim my independence and start rebuilding my life on my own terms. As I walked out of the apartment, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The life I had tried so hard to build was unraveling, but in its place, I was beginning to see a glimmer of hope. I had taken the first step toward finding myself again, even if it meant facing an uncertain future. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. I settled into a small apartment of my own, a cozy space that felt like a blank canvas for a new beginning. I returned to my graphic design work, and my colleagues welcomed me back with open arms. Their support was a balm to my soul, and it reminded me of why I had chosen this path in the first place. I threw myself back into my career with renewed passion. My work became a source of joy and empowerment. It was a relief to focus solely on projects that mattered to me, without the constant pressure to prioritize someone else's expectations. I started to explore new hobbies, painting, hiking, and even cooking, which had always been on the back burner. It felt exhilarating to rediscover parts of myself that had been overshadowed by my previous relationship. One day, while I was at a coffee shop, I ran into old friends. It was wonderful to reconnect with them and share stories about our lives. They were genuinely happy to see me and were curious about my new beginnings. It felt good to share my journey and receive their encouragement. It was a reminder that I had not only lost myself in the past relationship but also gained a new sense of clarity and purpose. Months later, Jake reached out to me. I was surprised to receive a message from him, especially since I had not heard from him since moving out. He was candid about his struggles, including losing his job and feeling lost without me. He expressed a desire to talk and possibly rekindle our relationship. I was tempted to meet with him, to see if there was any way to find closure or understanding. However, after reflecting on everything I had been through, I realized that my life had taken a new direction. I had found a stronger sense of self-worth and clarity about what I wanted. The idea of going back to a relationship that had caused me so much pain seemed like a step backward. When we finally met, Jake was visibly different. He seemed older, more worn out, and his demeanor was one of regret. He apologized for how he had treated me and admitted that he had made mistakes. But as we talked, I knew deep down that the relationship we had was not something I wanted to revisit. I've changed a lot, Jake said, his voice filled with remorse. I realize now how much I took you for granted. I'm sorry for everything. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. I appreciate your apology, Jake, but I've grown a lot since we parted ways. I'm in a different place now, and I need to keep moving forward. He nodded, understanding my decision. I get it, Maya. I hope you find the happiness you're looking for. As I walked away from that meeting, I felt a profound sense of closure. I was finally free from the shadows of my past, ready to embrace the future with confidence. I had reclaimed my independence and learned to value myself in ways I hadn't before. My journey of self-discovery had been challenging, but it had led me to a place of personal fulfillment and happiness. The story of my life had come full circle, and I was ready to write the next chapter with a heart full of hope and a mind clear about what truly mattered to me.
This story is titled, Step Mom and Dad Went on Vacation with Their Daughter, Leaving Me Alone and Laughing at Me. You are nothing but a freeloader living in our house like you own the place. So I made sure they didn't come back into my house. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Hi Reddit. I need to get this off my chest because even months later, I'm still unpacking everything that happened. I'll try not to ramble, but it's a story that started years ago, and I honestly didn't see any of it coming until it hit me like a train. My name's Ellie, and I'm 22 years old. What I'm about to tell you isn't some made-up family drama. It's my life, and I promise I never thought I'd find myself posting something like this here. But hey, life's funny like that. To really understand the chaos that went down, you need to know a bit of my backstory. My mom, Sarah, was the strongest woman I knew. She was a planner, down to the tiniest details of life. She worked as a senior accountant and was the kind of person who had everything neatly filed and sorted. Receipts, life insurance policies, you name it. She even wrote out a whole will years before she got sick. I used to think it was a little weird, but I get it now. She always said, "I want to make sure you're okay no matter what." Mom passed away from intestinal cancer when I was 18. I don't know if any of you have dealt with something like that, but watching someone you love slowly deteriorate is devastating. She fought so hard for 4 years, though, and never once complained. She quit her job to focus on treatment, and somehow, through everything, she kept planning, making sure all the paperwork for the house, finances, and my future were solid. Before she passed, she sat me down and said, "Ellie, this house is yours now. It's your home, and I want you to keep it. Promise me you'll always take care of it." I was so young at the time, just weeks away from starting college. I barely understood how any of it worked, but I knew one thing. That house was the last piece of her. My mom bought it before she even met my dad. She worked her butt off for it, paid off the mortgage, and built a beautiful life for us there. She made sure it would go to me, no one else. Here's where my dad comes into the picture. My parents divorced when I was 9. There was no big dramatic fallout, no custody battle, no fights over property. My dad just left. He met someone else, Diane, and decided he wanted a new life with her. He remarried pretty quickly and had my half-sister Maya. To be fair, Dad did one thing right. He paid for my college up front by putting money into a separate account. That was his version of child support, I guess. I wasn't angry back then. I just sort of accepted that I wasn't part of his new family anymore. I'd visit them sometimes during the holidays. Diane was never outright mean to me, but it was obvious she didn't really see me as family. She'd do that thing where she'd invite me for dinner, but act like she hoped I'd say no. "Ellie, you're welcome to join us for dinner," she'd say in this overly cheerful voice while stirring a pot of something. It felt so forced that it made my skin crawl. Dad, meanwhile, was always working to provide for his family, his new family. Maya was about 10 years younger than me, and while I tried to bond with her, I always felt like a guest whenever I was at their house. You know when you're somewhere, and you just know you don't belong? That's how it felt. They lived in a rented house back then. Nothing fancy, but comfortable enough. Anyway, when Mom passed, I had no idea how to handle the house. I was too numb to think straight. Dad and Diane came over right after the funeral, and to my surprise, they offered to help me out. Dad said, "Ellie, you can't live alone right now. It's too much to handle. Let us stay here for the summer, and we'll help take care of everything while you figure things out." I didn't argue. I was a mess. I'd just lost my mom, my anchor, and the thought of being alone in that big, quiet house scared me. Diane put on her best, sympathetic face, acting like she was there for me, while Maya wandered through the house like it was a playground. I remember sitting in Mom's office, my office now, staring at her degrees on the wall and her neatly arranged financial books. She'd worked so hard to make sure I'd have a home, and yet I couldn't even bring myself to touch her things. I let Dad and Diane move into the spare room and Maya into what used to be Mom's craft room. By the end of the summer, I was getting ready to leave for college out of state. That's when Dad brought up the idea of them staying permanently. Over breakfast one morning, he pushed his coffee aside and said, "Ellie, what if we stayed here while you're at school? You won't have to worry about bills, maintenance, or the house sitting empty. It'll be good for all of us." Diane chimed in, flipping pancakes at the stove. "We'd take care of everything, Ellie. The house will be in perfect shape when you come home." At the time, it made sense. They'd been decent housemates over the summer. Diane had even softened up a bit. She'd cook meals for me and invite me to her weird little book club meetings where middle-aged women gushed over bad romance novels. Maya started calling me her cool sister, which I'll admit warmed my heart a little. So I agreed. I didn't see any harm in it. I trusted them. Over the next 4 years, I came home for breaks and holidays, and honestly, it was okay. Diane would cook huge welcome home dinners. Dad would crack stupid dad jokes, and Maya would show me her latest middle school drama. I started to believe we'd turned into this strange but functional blended family. Sure, there were little things, like Diane rearranging furniture or making subtle comments about the house, but I shrugged them off. It wasn't worth making waves. When I called Dad my senior year of college to tell him I'd accepted a job back in my hometown, he seemed thrilled. "That's great, Ellie. We'll have the house ready for you." I didn't think twice about it. I graduated, packed up my stuff, and made the long trip home, excited to start this new chapter. I should have known something was wrong when the taxi pulled up to the house, and I noticed new curtains in the windows. Little things had changed. The rose bushes Mom planted were still there, but they were pruned differently. The front porch looked repainted. I didn't think much of it until I walked up to the door, pulled out my key, and it didn't fit. That's when everything started to unravel. I'll never forget the exact moment I realized something was seriously wrong. The taxi dropped me off on a warm, sunny afternoon. It felt like such a perfect day to be starting fresh. I was 22, degree in hand, job secured, and ready to move back into the house that I thought would always be mine. I even remember taking a moment to stand in front of the house, suitcase in hand, breathing in that weird mix of roses and fresh-cut grass. Mom's rose bushes were still there, though someone had trimmed them differently, like the rounded way Diane always shaped things. It was little details like that that I noticed first. Subtle changes. I walked up the porch, pulled out my house key, and slid it into the lock, already picturing my first night back in my room. I'd spent the whole car ride imagining throwing my stuff on my bed, unpacking a bit, and sleeping like a rock after the long trip. But the key didn't turn. I tried again. Nothing. I froze, mid-breath, just staring at the door like maybe I'd forgotten how locks worked. I jiggled the key. I turned it harder. Still nothing. No way. Maybe I'm overtired. Or maybe the lock's jammed. I knocked on the door, still half smiling, still hopeful. A moment later, Diane opened it, wearing an apron and looking like she'd just been baking, flour smudges on her hands and all. For half a second, her face went totally blank. Then she pasted on this fake smile and said, "Ellie, what are you doing here?" That question hit me like a slap. What was I doing here? I live here. Or at least I thought I did. I managed to stammer out, I'm moving back home. I told you guys about this, remember?" Her smile faltered. "Oh, right," she said, like she'd just remembered something she'd forgotten to put on the grocery list. She stepped aside reluctantly and let me in. The moment I rolled my suitcase inside, it was like stepping into a weird version of my house. The living room was different. Mom's furniture was still there, but it had been rearranged. Diane's tacky farmhouse decor, fake plants and cutesy signs that said things like "live, laugh, love," had taken over the mantel and the shelves. The old photo of Mom and me on the side table? Gone. A new family photo of Dad, Diane, and Maya was there instead. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, but I tried to stay calm. In the living room, Dad was sitting in Mom's old armchair, the one she used to curl up in with a book after work. He looked up from his tablet and did this awkward double take when he saw me. Maya was sprawled on the couch, her phone in hand, earbuds in. She barely glanced at me. "Hey, you're back!" Dad said, sounding like he was trying way too hard to sound cheerful. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a small smile. "Why are the locks changed?" At that, Dad scratched the back of his neck. His nervous habit always has been. "Oh, that. I changed them last month. There were a couple of break-ins in the neighborhood, so, for safety." "You didn't think to give me a new key?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I was already feeling weird about the whole situation. Diane, who was hovering behind me, jumped in. "We didn't think you'd be here so soon." "I graduated last week," I said, looking between them. "I told you guys I'd be moving back home for my job. I literally sent you the date I'd be here." Diane didn't respond. She just crossed her arms and stared at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. Dad stood up and gestured toward the office. "Ellie, can we talk privately for a second?" I followed him, suitcase still in hand, my heart pounding. Mom's old office looked more or less the same, though I noticed some of her books had been pushed aside for Diane's stuff. Dad shut the door behind us, and when he turned to face me, I saw it. He was nervous. Like he already knew what he was about to say was going to piss me off. "Listen," he started, his voice low. "There's something I need to tell you." Those words made my stomach drop. Dad hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. "Diane, she thinks this house is mine, that I let you live here after your mom passed." I stared at him, not comprehending. "What?" He sighed, looking at the floor. "I never told her the truth, that your mom bought the house and left it to you. I told her I gave it to your mom after the divorce, and that it reverted to me when she passed." I couldn't speak. I just stood there, staring at him, feeling like the air had been knocked out of me. My house. My mom's house. the one thing she fought so hard to make sure I'd have. And he lied about it? To Diane? For 4 years? I had to, Ellie, Dad continued, still not meeting my eyes. You don't understand what it's like. Diane wouldn't have agreed to live here if she thought it wasn't mine. I found my voice again, though it came out shaky. So what? You let her think she owns my house? And now I'm supposed to just, what, disappear? He grabbed my arm, pleading. No, it's not like that. Just give me a little time to fix this. I'll tell her the truth, I promise. Just not yet. I don't want to ruin my marriage. Please. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own father was asking me to lie, to let them stay in my house, the house my mom worked her whole life to buy, because he was too much of a coward to admit the truth to his wife. I took the keys he handed me for the new locks, but I was done. I felt sick. I felt betrayed. But mostly, I felt like an idiot for trusting them. I agreed to let him fix it. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't going to end well. That night at dinner, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Diane sat at the head of the table, smiling like nothing was wrong, but I caught her glancing at me every now and then. Sharp, calculating looks that made my skin crawl. Maya ignored me completely, and Dad barely spoke. I picked at my food, my mind spinning. This was only the beginning. I could feel it. You know how sometimes people don't have to say anything outright for you to know exactly how they feel about you? That's what living with Diane turned into. Constant, unspoken hostility wrapped in fake politeness. Dad was no better. He avoided me completely, as though ignoring the situation would make it disappear. It was as if I'd walked into someone else's house and had overstayed my welcome, except it was my house. The first few days were awkward but tolerable. I spent most of my time in my room unpacking my stuff, catching up with old friends over texts, and trying to process everything Dad had told me. The tension wasn't as bad at first, more like that quiet kind where you can feel people watching you. Diane would pop into the kitchen while I was making coffee and make passive remarks like, "Oh, you're up early. You must be on a college schedule still." Or, "Are you cooking for yourself tonight? I didn't realize you'd be eating in." The thing is, she wasn't yelling, but every comment carried an undertone that screamed, "You don't belong here." Then things escalated, fast. On a Wednesday morning, I was about to throw in a load of laundry. I'd left my clothes sorted in the laundry room and went to grab detergent. By the time I came back, Diane was pulling my clothes out of the washer and tossing them into a basket. My white shirts were suddenly mixed with dark clothes that hadn't been washed yet. I froze and just watched her for a second. "Oh," she said, like she'd only just noticed me. "I thought this was Maya's basket. You really should label your stuff. They were sorted," I said flatly. "And Maya doesn't do her own laundry, does she?" Her smile was razor thin. "Well, I can't keep track of everyone's messes around here." She picked up her cup of tea and walked out, leaving my clothes in a crumpled pile. I knew what she was doing. She wanted me to react, to cause a scene, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. That night at dinner, she made just enough food for 3 people. I didn't realize until I came to the table and saw 3 plates set. One for her, one for Dad, and one for Maya. She looked up at me and said, "Oh, Ellie, I thought you were eating out tonight." "You didn't say anything." "I live here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You didn't ask." She shrugged and smiled, a fake sweetness to it. "Well, there's bread in the pantry if you're hungry." I sat there for a second, considering walking out or even flipping out on her, but instead, I just grabbed my coat and left. I couldn't stand sitting across from them another second. I ended up at the local diner, eating a sandwich alone and texting one of my old friends from high school. "Please tell me you're free tomorrow. I need to get out of the house," I wrote. The next day, I reconnected with my friend Emily. She still lived nearby, and when I told her about the situation, she gave me that wide-eyed look you give someone when you can't believe what you're hearing. "Wait, they're living in your house? Acting like you're the guest?" "Ellie, what the hell?" "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "Dad's too much of a coward to tell Diane the truth, and she's trying to make my life miserable. I feel like I'm losing my mind." We spent the afternoon hanging out, catching up on life, and for a few hours I almost felt like myself again. Emily even joked, "If she keeps pushing, I'll come over and put her in her place for you." It made me laugh, but when I got home, the dread came rushing back. The house was dark and silent. I flicked on the hallway light and noticed something odd. My shoes, which I'd left neatly by the door, had been moved into the coat closet. It was a small thing, but it sent a clear message. Diane didn't want any trace of me visible in her space. Over the next week, she doubled down. I'd wake up to find my things moved around, like my coffee mug mysteriously shoved to the back of the cabinet, or my mail accidentally tossed into a pile of junk. One morning, I went to take a shower only to realize the hot water was ice cold. Maya had conveniently taken a 45-minute shower right before me. Diane made a show of saying, "Oh, Ellie, I guess you'll just have to get up earlier." Maya's growing, and she takes longer these days. The worst part was watching Maya change. When we were younger, she used to follow me around like a little shadow. She'd call me her big sister and beg me to braid her hair. Now, she rolled her eyes whenever I walked into the room and muttered things like, "She's so lazy, Mom." I even overheard her on the phone saying, "I don't know why she's still here. It's not even her house." That hurt more than I care to admit. And then there was Dad. I swear I could feel him avoiding me. He'd come home late or go for walks anytime Diane started needling me in front of him. If I caught him alone and tried to talk about it, he'd just mumble something about keeping the peace. Keeping the peace? For who? I hit my breaking point when Diane moved Mom's favorite vase. It had been on the mantel for as long as I could remember. This beautiful ceramic vase with blue flowers painted on it. One day I came home and found it shoved onto a random shelf in the corner, almost hidden. In its place was one of Diane's tacky rustic pieces, an ugly wooden sign that said, "Home Sweet Home." I asked her about it directly. "Why did you move the vase?" "Oh," she said, not even looking up from her tablet. "I just thought it didn't match the new style I'm going for in here. I'm sure you understand." I didn't reply, but I felt something snap inside me. That vase was more than just decor. It was a piece of my mom, a memory of her, and Diane had no right to touch it. That night, I started packing up Diane's things in my head. I wasn't ready to act yet, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. By the time Saturday morning rolled around, I felt like I was living in someone else's house, an unwelcome guest in my own home. The hostility from Diane had grown so thick that even walking into the kitchen felt like stepping into enemy territory. I avoided being in the common spaces when she or Maya were around, just to keep my sanity. That morning, though, something was off. I woke up to silence. Total silence. No sound of Diane in the kitchen banging pots, no Maya blasting pop music from her room, and no Dad watching the morning news on TV. It was eerie. At first, I thought maybe they'd just gone out for breakfast or something, but the house felt abandoned. It was too clean. The kitchen counters were spotless, the dining table was empty, and even the shoes that were always cluttered near the front door were gone. I stood there barefoot, still in my pajamas, my stomach sinking. I checked my phone. Nothing. No texts, no missed calls. I tried calling Dad first. Straight to voicemail. That's weird. I tried him again. Same result. By this point, I felt like something wasn't right. Maybe it was paranoia after weeks of tension with Diane, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a regular Saturday morning. Finally, I dialed Diane. I was about to hang up after the fourth ring when she picked up. Her voice was sharp. "What do you want?" Her tone caught me completely off guard. I just wanted to know where everyone is. I woke up and the house is empty." She laughed. Not a normal laugh. A mean, ugly sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, didn't we tell you? We're in the Maldives. You know, sunny beaches, luxury resorts, the whole deal." I blinked, gripping the phone tighter. "What? The Maldives? First-class flights and everything," she added with mock cheer. "We didn't mention it because, frankly, we didn't want you tagging along. You're not exactly in the position to pay your way, are you?" My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" That's when she dropped the act completely. "I'm talking about you living in our house like some entitled brat," she spat. "Your father might be too soft to say it, but I'm not. You're a freeloader, Ellie. You've been mooching off us long enough. Do you know how embarrassing it is to have a grown woman squatting in our house while we're paying all the bills?" I could barely breathe. My hands were shaking, and I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, my legs too weak to hold me up. "It's not your house," I managed to choke out. "It's my house." She ignored me. "We're done, Ellie. When we get back, I want you gone. I don't care where you go. Sleep on a park bench for all I care. But you're not staying here. If you're still in that house when we come back, I'll personally throw you out." In the background, I could hear Maya laughing and Dad saying something I couldn't quite make out. The sound of it twisted the knife deeper. "Diane, you don't bother trying to call your father," she interrupted, her voice icy. "He agrees with me. He's just too weak to tell you himself. We've already blocked your number. Have a nice life, Ellie." And then she hung up. I sat there in shock, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I stared at the phone, half expecting her to call back and say it was some cruel joke, but she didn't. My father's silence on the other end had been enough to confirm everything. They were gone, on vacation, living it up on a tropical island while I sat alone in what was supposed to be my house. And the worst part? They planned to throw me out when they got back. For the first few minutes, I just sat there, my mind blank. I couldn't process it. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that my dad, my own father, had let this happen. He didn't stop her. He didn't stand up for me. He just went along with it. But the shock didn't last long. It turned into something else. Something I hadn't felt in weeks. Rage. They wanted me gone? Fine. But they'd forgotten one very important thing. This was my house. I spent the next hour sitting in that chair, staring at the walls, replaying the conversation in my head. Diane's voice echoed over and over. Freeloader, squatter, embarrassing. It wasn't just what she said, but the way she said it. Like I was some useless parasite clinging to their perfect lives. Like I didn't belong here. Well, I wasn't going to let her win. By noon, I had a plan. First things first, I blocked their numbers. I didn't want to hear a word from any of them, not even Dad. Then I called a locksmith. Emergency service? The guy asked when I explained what I needed. Yes, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. As soon as possible. The locksmith arrived that afternoon, an older guy with kind eyes who didn't ask too many questions. He changed every lock in the house. Front door, back door, garage door, you name it. It cost me more than I wanted to spend. But at that point, I didn't care. Anyone else have keys to these doors? He asked as he handed me the new set. Not anymore, I replied. Once the locks were changed, I grabbed some garbage bags and boxes and started packing up their stuff. I was done pretending like everything was fine. If Diane and Dad thought they could waltz back into my house after treating me like garbage, they were in for a surprise. I went room by room. Diane's expensive clothes? Packed. Her fancy bathroom products cluttering up the counters? Into a bag. Maya's toys, school supplies, and whatever else she'd left lying around? Boxed up. Dad's golf clubs, the ones he never used but always bragged about having, went straight into the garage. By the time I finished, the sun was setting, and the garage was packed full of their things. It was exhausting, but it felt good, like I was reclaiming what was mine piece by piece. I sat on the couch that night, staring at the clean, empty space that had been taken over for years. It felt strange, quiet, but it also felt like home again. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in forever. I brewed myself a cup of coffee, sat in Mom's old chair, and watched the sunlight stream through the window. I knew this was just the beginning. Diane wasn't going to let this go without a fight, and Dad, well, I didn't know what to expect from him anymore. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going anywhere. Point. It was a Friday evening when the storm hit. I'd been expecting it. Honestly, I'd spent the whole week mentally preparing for the explosion that was bound to happen once they came back and saw what I'd done. I even rehearsed what I'd say, over and over again, so I wouldn't stumble or give them a chance to manipulate me. That afternoon, I'd come home from work, drop my bag by the door, and noticed how quiet the house was. It wasn't the eerie, empty quiet I'd felt that morning after Diane's call. No. This was the kind of quiet that felt right. It felt like peace. My peace. I had just sat down with my laptop to catch up on some emails when I heard the car pull into the driveway. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made my stomach twist, but I forced myself to stay calm. I didn't move from my spot on the couch as I listened to doors slam, footsteps pound up the walkway, and then the sound of Diane trying, and failing, to unlock the front door. She started banging on it immediately. Ellie! Her voice was already shrill. Ellie, what the hell is going on? Why won't the door open? I let her bang for another 30 seconds before I stood up, grabbed the new keys from the counter, and walked to the door. I took my sweet time unlocking it, savoring the brief pause in her yelling. When I finally opened the door, I was greeted with Diane's furious face. Her hair was a mess, her face red, and she looked like she was ready to bite my head off. Behind her, Dad stood stiff and awkward, looking anywhere but at me, and Maya was hanging back near the car, her arms crossed and scowling. What did you do? Diane demanded, shoving her way past me into the entryway. Why did you change the locks? I stepped aside and let her storm in. Dad followed quietly, his shoulders hunched, avoiding my gaze. Maya trailed after him, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. Diane turned on me immediately. I want an explanation. Right now. I crossed my arms and met her glare without flinching. It's pretty simple, I said. This is my house. You don't live here anymore. Her mouth fell open like I'd slapped her. Your house? Yes, my house. The house my mom bought, the house she left to me, the one you've been living in under a lie for the last 4 years. For a split second, the room went silent. Diane looked at Dad, her face full of confusion and growing anger. What is she talking about? Dad didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen. I turned to him, my voice sharp. Tell her, Dad. Tell her the truth. Diane spun to face him. What truth? What is she saying? Dad mumbled something I couldn't hear. His voice was so quiet, I thought he might have been choking on his own guilt. Speak up, Diane snapped. What is she talking about, Richard? Dad finally looked up, his face pale. It's true, he said, his voice weak. The house. It's not mine. It never was. Sarah bought it before we were married. She left it to Ellie, in her will. For a second, Diane just stared at him, blinking as though she couldn't process the words. Then her face turned a deep shade of red. You lied to me? Dad flinched, like she'd struck him. I didn't mean... You told me this was your house, she shrieked. You said you let Ellie stay here out of the goodness of your heart. Do you have any idea how stupid this makes me look? Her voice was loud enough that I was sure the neighbors could hear, but I didn't care. Let her scream. Let her throw her tantrum. I'd spent weeks feeling like a stranger in my own home. She could deal with a little reality. Diane turned back to me, her eyes blazing. You ungrateful little brat. After everything we've done for you? I cut her off. Everything you've done for me? Like what? Trying to erase my mom from this house? Calling me a freeloader? Planning to throw me out? That's not helping, Diane. She opened her mouth to argue, but I wasn't finished. Your stuff is in the garage. Take it and leave. At that, Maya finally spoke up. Mom, let's just go. Her voice was quiet, and for the first time, I saw something other than anger in her expression. Embarrassment, maybe. She looked at me for half a second before turning away again. Diane ignored her. We are not leaving, she snarled. This is our home, too. No, it's not, I said, my voice steady. It's mine, and I want you out. Dad finally stepped forward, looking like he wanted to fix everything with a single sentence. Ellie, please, he said, his voice trembling. We don't have anywhere to go right now. Just give us a few weeks. I held up my hand. No. His face crumbled. Please, sweetheart. I know I messed up, but we're family. Family doesn't treat each other like this, I shot back. You let this happen. You let Diane think this was her house. You let her treat me like garbage. And you stood there and said nothing. Dad had nothing to say to that. He just looked down at the floor like a scolded child. Diane, on the other hand, wasn't ready to give up. You're a selfish little girl, she spat. You think you're so high and mighty because of this house? You wouldn't even have it if it weren't for your father. I laughed bitterly. My father had nothing to do with this house. Mom bought it with her own money before you or him were even part of the picture. She made sure it would be mine because she knew I couldn't count on him. That shut her up. I turned back to Dad. You can take your stuff and leave. I'm done with this. For a moment, nobody moved. Diane stared at me like she wanted to lunge at me, but Dad finally nodded. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Fine, he whispered. It took them about an hour to load their things into the car. Diane didn't stop muttering under her breath the entire time, calling me names, swearing about how ungrateful I was. Dad just looked hollow. Maya stayed quiet, helping carry things without a word. When they were done, Dad knocked on the door one last time. I didn't open it. I watched from the window as they drove away, Diane's voice still faintly audible through the glass. The house was quiet again when they were gone. For the first time in years, it felt like it belonged to me, like it belonged to Mom. I sat down on the couch and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. They were gone. Finally. EC point. It's been 2 months since that day. Dad still tries to call from random numbers, but I don't pick up. Some relationships can't be fixed. And honestly, I don't want to. I'm focusing on myself now. My job is great, I've made friends at work, and I'm slowly healing from all of this. I planted new roses in Mom's garden, ones she would have loved, and I'm finally at peace here. To anyone reading this who's dealing with toxic family, sometimes you have to let go. You don't owe anyone your peace, especially not people who take advantage of you. Mom made sure I'd always have a home, and now I'm making sure I honor her by living in it the way she intended. This story is titled, My Daughter Falsely Accused Me, Leading to My Imprisonment for a Long Time, and now that I have been released, I will repay everything I went through in the same coin. Hey everyone! Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. I don't even know where to start. Writing this makes me so angry, but I need to get it out. My daughter, let's call her Sarah, has been nothing but trouble for years. I don't know if it's how we raised her or if she's just wired this way, but it feels like she was born to test my patience. She's selfish, ungrateful, and never takes responsibility for anything. It wasn't always this way. When she was little, she was sweet. A bit stubborn, sure, but I thought it was normal kid stuff. But then middle school hit, and everything changed. She started acting like the world owed her something, like she was better than everyone else. She'd throw tantrums if she didn't get her way, slam doors, scream at us, you name it. My wife kept saying, "It's just a phase. She'll grow out of it." She didn't. By the time Sarah hit her teenage years, it was like she'd decided to make our lives a living hell. She lied about everything: where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. If her lips were moving, she was probably lying. She skipped school so much that the principal called us in for a meeting. I told her she needed to shape up, but she just rolled her eyes and said, "Whatever, Dad." At 16, she dropped out of high school entirely. One day, she came home and announced she wasn't going back. "School's stupid," she said. "I don't need it." My wife and I begged her to reconsider, but she wasn't hearing it. She packed her things, said she was leaving, and walked out the door without even looking back. She ran off with some boyfriend, a loser who didn't have a job or any prospects. I don't even remember his name. For 3 years, we didn't hear a word from her. No calls, no texts, nothing. My wife was heartbroken. She cried herself to sleep so many nights, wondering if Sarah was okay, if she'd ever come back. Me? I was angry, but I also felt relieved. Without Sarah around, the house was quieter. No drama, no fighting. I thought, maybe this is for the best. Then one night, she showed up on our doorstep. It was pouring rain, and she was standing there soaked to the bone, holding a trash bag full of clothes. "I have nowhere else to go," she said. My first instinct was to slam the door in her face, but my wife rushed past me and pulled her inside before I could say a word. She hugged Sarah like she'd just come back from war, even though Sarah hadn't bothered to call us in 3 years. "She's our daughter," my wife kept saying. "We can't just leave her out there." I let her stay, but I knew it was a mistake. And boy, was I right. At first, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she'd changed. Maybe she'd finally learned something from her time away. Nope. Within days, she was back to her old ways. She didn't look for a job, didn't help around the house, didn't do anything except sit on the couch scrolling through her phone. We'd ask her to do something simple: take out the trash, do the dishes, anything, and she'd roll her eyes like we were asking her to move mountains. "Why can't you do it?" she'd say. "I'm tired." Tired from what? Sitting on her ass all day? And then there were the late nights. She'd leave the house after dinner, saying she was going out for a walk, but she'd be gone for hours. Sometimes she wouldn't come home until after midnight. When I asked where she'd been, she'd just shrug and say, "Nowhere," like it was none of my business. She'd come back smiling, like she didn't have a care in the world, then flop down on the couch and start scrolling through her phone again. I tried to talk to my wife about it, but she kept making excuses. "She's been through a lot," she'd say. "She just needs time to adjust." Adjust to what? Sitting around all day, acting like the queen of the house while we bent over backward to accommodate her? One night, I couldn't take it anymore. Sarah had been out until 1 a.m., and when she finally came home, I confronted her. "Where the hell have you been?" I asked. She just laughed and said, "Why do you care?" That's when I told her she needed to start pulling her weight or find somewhere else to live. Her response? "You're supposed to take care of me. That's what parents do." I couldn't believe it. After everything she'd done, dropping out of school, running away, ignoring us for 3 years, she still thought we owed her something. That was the moment I decided I'd had enough. I gave her an ultimatum. She had 24 hours to pack her things and leave. My wife tried to argue, but I shut her down. "She's an adult," I said. "She made her choices. It's time for her to deal with the consequences." At first, Sarah didn't take me seriously. She just laughed and said, "Yeah, okay, Dad," like it was some kind of joke. But when she realized I wasn't kidding, her attitude changed. She started yelling. "You're a terrible father," she screamed. "You don't love me." I stood my ground and gave her my words. She stormed off to her room, slamming the door so hard that the whole house shook. My wife gave me the silent treatment for the rest of the day, but I didn't care. It happened before the 4 hours I gave Sarah to leave were even up. I was in the living room, sitting on the couch and scrolling through the news on my phone, trying to decompress after another argument with my wife about her enabling Sarah. My patience was already worn thin, but I figured I just had to hold out until tomorrow night. Then Sarah would be gone for good, and I could finally have my home back. But life has a funny way of kicking you when you're already down. There was a loud knock at the door. 3 quick, sharp bangs that sent my heart racing. It wasn't a friendly knock. I got up to answer it, my stomach twisting into knots. When I opened the door, there were 3 police officers standing there, all of them looking dead serious. "Sir, we have a warrant to search your property," one of them said. My mind went blank for a second. "What? Why?" "We received an anonymous tip about illegal drugs being stored in this house," the officer explained. "The report is filed under your name, my house." I felt like the ground had just been pulled out from under me. I wanted to argue, to slam the door in their faces, but I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere. So I stepped aside and let them in, feeling a sense of dread settle over me like a heavy blanket. They spread out quickly, one officer staying in the living room while the others began searching the house. My wife stood frozen in the hallway, her face pale as a ghost. Sarah, on the other hand, sat on the couch, completely unfazed. She even had the nerve to smirk at me as the officers went upstairs to check the bedrooms. I knew. I didn't have proof, but I knew this was her doing. Who else could it be? She'd been sneaking around, staying out late, hanging with God knows who. She was the only one who had anything to gain from this chaos. The officers searched her room first. I stood in the hallway, watching as they tore through her things, flipping through her drawers, pulling the sheets off her bed, emptying out her backpack. But they didn't find anything. Not a single thing. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe Sarah hadn't done anything after all. Then they moved on to my room. I didn't think they'd find anything there. Why would they? I wasn't involved in anything illegal, and I certainly didn't have drugs in my house. But then one of the officers pulled back the mattress on my bed and stopped. "Here," he said, holding up a bag filled with what I immediately recognized as heroin. As the officer held up the first bag of heroin, I glanced at Sarah, hoping to see shock or confusion on her face. Instead, she smirked, her lips curling into a look that sent a chill down my spine. She didn't flinch, didn't deny anything. She just sat there like this was all a game to her. My blood boiled as I realized she wasn't just indifferent. She was proud of what she'd done. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. "That's not mine," I said automatically, my voice shaking. But the officers weren't listening. They kept searching, and by the time they were done, they'd found several more bags hidden under my bed and across the room. "Sir, you're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance," one of them said as they pulled out the handcuffs. My wife burst into tears. Sarah just sat there, watching the whole thing like it was a movie. When they cuffed me and led me out the door, I looked back at her one last time, hoping to see some kind of guilt or remorse on her face. Instead, she smiled. Smiled. The next few hours were a blur. They took me down to the station, fingerprinted me, took my mugshot. I kept saying over and over that the drugs weren't mine, that someone had set me up, but no one cared. The evidence was in my house, under my bed. That was enough for them. They denied me bail, saying the amount of heroin they found suggested I was involved in distribution. My lawyer tried to fight it, but it didn't matter. I was stuck in jail, waiting for the investigation to play out. Over the next few weeks, they started looking into the case. They tested the drugs for fingerprints, checked for DNA, anything that could link them to me. But there was nothing. My fingerprints weren't on the bags, and there was no evidence tying me to the drugs. Still, that didn't mean I was off the hook. The house was in my name, which meant the drugs were my responsibility, unless I could prove otherwise. My lawyer argued that someone else must have planted them there, but without solid evidence, it was my word against theirs. I knew it was Sarah. I didn't know how she'd done it, but I knew it was her. Maybe she'd been storing the drugs in my room without me noticing, or maybe she'd planted them there as a way to get back at me for kicking her out. Either way, she was the only one who could have done it. I spent 5 agonizing months in jail while the case dragged on, not because the investigation was complicated, or because there wasn't enough evidence to clear my name, but simply because the court's schedule was backlogged. Apparently, justice had to wait its turn, even when someone's life was being torn apart. The delay felt like an eternity. Every day in that cell was another day I sat with my thoughts, replaying everything over and over. The betrayal, the humiliation, the helplessness, it all circled in my head like a broken record. My body was locked up, but my mind never stopped pacing. I couldn't stop thinking about how my own daughter had done this to me. I wondered if she was laughing about it, going about her life like nothing had happened, while I was stuck in a place I didn't belong. My wife visited me a few times during those months, but even her presence felt like another weight on my chest. She wasn't there to offer support or reassurance, not really. Every time she came, it felt like she was probing, fishing for answers I couldn't give her. I needed her to believe in me, to fight for me, but instead, She just seemed confused, unsure if she could trust the man she'd been married to for 20 years. Why would Sarah do something like this? She asked during one visit, her voice hesitant, like she couldn't even say the words out loud without doubting herself. I clenched my fist so tightly my knuckles turned white. You know why? I said, trying to keep my voice calm but failing. You've seen what she's like. You've seen her lie, manipulate, twist things to get what she wants. This isn't new. She shook her head, her face pale and drawn. But planting drugs? Getting you arrested? That's not just lying. I don't know. It's evil. Her voice cracked, and she looked down at her hands, wringing them like they held the answers. She's been on this path for years, I said bitterly. You just didn't want to see it. You kept making excuses for her. She's been through a lot. Every time she crossed the line, you let her get away with it, and now this is where we are. My words hit her like a slap, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too tired, too broken to soften the truth for her. If she had stood by me, believed in me from the start, maybe I could have handled this better. But instead, she kept second-guessing me, making me feel like I was the one on trial. Maybe you just didn't know what was happening, she said during another visit, her voice trembling. Maybe there's more to this. I stared at her, stunned by how little faith she had in me. Do you even hear yourself? I snapped. You're my wife. You've known me for 2 decades. Do you really think I'd get involved in drugs? Do you really think I'd risk everything for… What? Some heroin under my bed? She didn't answer. She just sat there, looking at the floor like a scolded child. But her silence spoke volumes. She didn't believe me. Not completely. She might have wanted to, but deep down, she had doubts. And that doubt cut deeper than anything else. The worst part was knowing that Sarah had planned this. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. This was calculated. She'd taken the time to hide the drugs in my room, knowing it would shift the blame onto me. She'd reported me anonymously, making sure the police had a reason to show up with a warrant. She'd done everything she could to frame me, and it had worked. And yet, my own wife couldn't see it. My parents, who visited once, couldn't see it. Even some of my so-called friends started to distance themselves, whispering behind my back. The evidence might not have pointed to me directly, but the stigma of being arrested for drugs was enough to make people doubt. And doubt is a powerful thing. It sticks to you like a stain you can't wash off. While the court delayed my hearing again and again, I had nothing to do but sit in that cell and stew in my anger. I thought about all the times Sarah had lied to my face, all the times I'd given her chances she didn't deserve. I thought about the way she'd smirked when the police took me away, like she knew exactly what she was doing. I thought about my wife's tears, not because I was in jail, but because she didn't know if she could trust me anymore. By the time I finally got my day in court, I wasn't the same person who had walked into that jail 5 months earlier. I was harder, angrier, and less willing to forgive. The system had failed me. My family had failed me. And all because of the selfish actions of one person, my own daughter. When the evidence finally came to light, Sarah's texts, the witnesses who saw her sneaking around, the lack of fingerprints or DNA tying me to the drugs, it was like the world suddenly remembered I existed. The charges against me were dropped, but the damage was already done. 5 months of my life were gone. 5 months where I was treated like a criminal, doubted by the people I thought loved me. My name might have been cleared legally, but socially, emotionally, I knew I'd never be the same. I wasn't just angry at Sarah. I was angry at everyone who doubted me, who'd left me to rot in that cell while they questioned whether I was the kind of man who would hide heroin under his bed. And in that anger, a seed of revenge started to grow. I didn't just want Sarah to face the consequences of her actions. I wanted her to know what it felt like to lose everything, to have the world look at her the way it had looked at me. I wanted her to pay. The first thing I did when I got home was sit in the living room in silence. My wife was there, standing awkwardly by the doorway like she didn't know what to say. Maybe she thought I'd be thrilled to be back, or maybe she expected me to forgive everything and move on. But I couldn't even look at her without feeling a mix of betrayal and anger. Why didn't you believe me? I finally asked, breaking the silence. My voice cracked a little, which pissed me off even more. I wanted to sound strong, not broken. She didn't answer right away. She just stood there, wringing her hands. It was hard, okay? The drugs were found in your room. What was I supposed to think? You were supposed to know me, I snapped. You've known me for 20 years. You've seen what Sarah's like. But the second something bad happens, you turn on me? My voice was rising now, and I didn't care. You know I didn't do it. Deep down, you knew. But instead of standing by me, You let me rot in jail while you played mom to the person who actually did this. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't about to feel sorry for her. She wasn't the one who'd spent months in a cell, treated like a criminal. I'm sorry, she whispered, but it didn't mean anything to me. Sorry didn't give me back the months I lost. Sorry didn't erase the fact that she doubted me when I needed her most. Over the next few days, I tried to piece my life back together. The investigation had finally turned up undeniable proof that Sarah was behind everything. The text messages on her phone showed that she'd been dealing drugs for months, maybe longer. She'd been using our house as a stash spot, hiding the heroin under my bed so that if anything went wrong, I'd take the fall. The texts were damning. They showed her coordinating with a dealer, talking about moving product, and even laughing about how Dad would never notice. I read every single one of them, my hands shaking with rage. How could my own daughter do this to me? What kind of person sets up their own father to save themselves? The police also found witnesses who came forward, saying they'd seen Sarah sneaking around late at night, meeting with sketchy people in parking lots and alleyways. One of her so-called friends admitted that Sarah had bragged about hiding drugs in my house because she thought it was the perfect cover. When the police finally issued a warrant for her arrest, I felt a mix of relief and bitterness. Relief that they were finally going after the real culprit, but bitterness that it had taken so long, and that I'd had to pay the price for her actions. Sarah was arrested a few days after I got home. They found her staying at some rundown apartment with a bunch of lowlifes. When the police searched the place, they found more drugs, along with scales, baggies, and cash. It was clear she wasn't just using, she was fully involved in the drug trade. I thought seeing her arrested would bring me some kind of closure, but it didn't. If anything, it just made me angrier. She didn't look scared or ashamed when they took her away. She looked annoyed, like this was just some inconvenience she'd have to deal with. My wife was devastated when she heard about the arrest. She's still our daughter, she kept saying over and over, like a broken record. She's made mistakes, but she's still our baby. I couldn't take it anymore. She's not my daughter, I snapped. Not anymore. My daughter wouldn't do this to me. My daughter wouldn't destroy her own family just to save her own skin. The legal process that followed was long, exhausting, and messy, much like everything else Sarah had left in her wake. She was charged with possession of drugs, intent to distribute, and perhaps most painfully for me, false accusations against her own father. That charge hit me like a gut punch every time I heard it spoken aloud in court, knowing that she had deliberately orchestrated my arrest, gone out of her way to frame me and watch me suffer, made my blood boil. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The text between her and her dealer, the witness statements, and even her own carelessness when stashing drugs in her apartment painted a damning picture. But as damning as it was, it didn't make things easier for me. Every court hearing, every delay, every smug look she gave when she was brought in for questioning, it all chipped away at whatever pieces of humanity I still clung to. As part of the investigation, Sarah was required to take a drug test. Unsurprisingly, it came back positive, not just for heroin, but for several other substances, including cocaine and amphetamines. It was the final nail in the coffin. The daughter I had once rocked to sleep as a baby, the little girl I had taught to ride a bike, wasn't just a liar and a manipulator, she was an addict and a criminal. Seeing the results didn't shock me, but it hurt. It was one thing to know in your gut that your child is on a destructive path. It's another thing entirely to see it spelled out in black and white. Part of me wanted to feel pity for her, to see her as the victim of her own choices. But that part of me was drowned out by anger. She hadn't just ruined her life. She had tried to ruin mine. My lawyer told me I didn't have to attend every hearing, but I couldn't stay away. I needed to see her face, needed her to know that I wasn't going to let her get away with this without seeing the damage she caused. At one point during the trial, her lawyer argued that Sarah's actions were the result of addiction, that she was not in her right mind when she reported me to the police. I couldn't stay silent, not about this. As I sat there, I knew this wasn't some desperate mistake driven by addiction. It wasn't about weakness or bad judgment. It was intentional. She had never been a family person, never cared about anyone but herself. This wasn't about drugs. It was about revenge. She wanted to hurt me and put me in trouble for kicking her out. That much was clear. But I kept those thoughts to myself, knowing that the truth was already laid bare for everyone to see. There was no need for me to speak. Her actions spoke louder than anything I could say. The trial dragged on for months, delayed repeatedly by procedural nonsense and Sarah's lawyer trying to reduce her charges. Meanwhile, I tried to rebuild the wreckage of my life. People in the neighborhood still whispered when I walked by, some still unsure whether I was truly innocent despite the evidence. My wife seemed to exist in a constant state of denial. She's sick, she kept saying, like it was a mantra that would make all of this easier to swallow. She didn't mean it. She didn't mean it? I snapped one night after dinner. She knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just using, she was dealing. She put my name on a report to the police. How the hell do you not mean that? We're her parents, no matter what. Zrania, her voice trembling. Not anymore, I said coldly, pushing back my chair and leaving the table. When the verdict finally came, it felt more like a formality than a victory. Sarah was found guilty on all charges: possession of narcotics, intent to distribute, and filing false accusations. The judge didn't hold back. However, instead of prison, she was sentenced to serve 8 years in a long-term drug rehabilitation center. The judge believed that addressing her addiction was critical to ensuring she didn't repeat her actions. She showed little emotion as the sentence was read, only giving a slight shrug as if to say, "It is what it is." I wanted to feel relief, but I didn't. The damage was already done. 8 years wouldn't erase the 5 months I spent in a cell. It wouldn't fix the relationships that had been shattered or undo the stain on my reputation. If anything, her conviction felt like the closing chapter of a book I wished I'd never started reading. After the trial, I got a restraining order against Sarah to make sure she could never come near me again. Even when she eventually gets out, I don't want her anywhere near my life. She made her choices, and I made mine. For a while, I couldn't sleep. I kept waking up in the middle of the night, haunted by everything that had happened. My wife, on the other hand, seemed stuck in the past. She started writing Sarah letters in prison, trying to keep some sort of relationship alive. At first, I didn't say anything, but eventually, it became too much. "What are you hoping to accomplish?" I asked her one night, when I caught her sealing another envelope. "She's our daughter," she said again. That same broken mantra that had driven me up the wall for months. "She stopped being our daughter the day she put me in cuffs," I replied, my voice cold and sharp. "I don't care what she's going through. I don't care if she gets better. She's out of my life, and that's not changing." That conversation was the tipping point. We were no longer on the same page, no longer even in the same book. My wife clung to the idea of Sarah as the daughter we used to know, the little girl she'd raised, the baby she once held. But that version of Sarah didn't exist anymore. Not to me, and maybe not to anyone. It became clear that our marriage wasn't going to survive this. The trust between us was gone, eroded by months of doubt, anger, and pain. My wife had doubted me when I needed her most, and now she was trying to hold on to a relationship with the person who had destroyed everything we'd built. How could we come back from that? The answer was simple. We couldn't. One night, after another tense argument about Sarah, I finally said it out loud. "I don't think we can keep doing this." My wife looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "You're saying you want to leave?" "I'm saying this isn't working," I said, my voice steady but heavy. "We're not the same people we were before all of this. I don't trust you, and you don't understand me anymore. And honestly, I don't think I can stay in this house, surrounded by everything that reminds me of her." She nodded slowly, wiping her tears. "I don't want this, but I understand." We agreed to separate a few weeks later. She kept the house, the one place I didn't want to be anymore. I moved into a small apartment across town, far enough to feel like I was starting fresh, but close enough to handle the practicalities of dividing our lives. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The worst part wasn't the physical separation. It was the realization that the life we'd built together had crumbled so completely. We'd spent 2 decades as partners, raising a family, building a home, only for it to fall apart in the wake of our daughter's actions. Sarah's choices hadn't just destroyed my trust in her. They'd destroyed my marriage. The worst part of all this wasn't the jail time or the trial. It was the realization that the life I thought I had was never as strong as I believed. My marriage had been hanging by a thread, and I hadn't even realized it until it was too late. Maybe someday I'll find a way to let go of all this anger, but not today. Today, I just focus on putting one foot in front of the other and keeping Sarah as far away from me as possible. She made her choices, and she'll live with the consequences. But so will I.